Hey everyone, Ken from GoalRival here, releasing the first episode of this podcast, which should really be titled An American's Attempt of Getting More into Football. My goal for this podcast is to create interesting long form episodes while also doing weekly roundups of funny stories across the different football leagues. This episode is going to be focused on one topic and one topic alone, which is the World Cup qualifying match of 1992 of Puerto Rico versus the Dominican Republic, which is a very interesting episode, and we'll get to it in just a second. But before we jump into that, a little bit about me. Who am I? Well, my name is Ken, and I'm going to completely discredit myself at the start of this podcast by saying that I've only just recently, in the last few years, have gotten into the beautiful sport that is football. I was actually born and raised in Puerto Rico for some time, where football is not really a popular sport. We actually call it balompié over there. My side of the island that I lived at, it wasn't very popular at all. My side of the island and most of the island as a whole, the sports that are very popular are basketball, volleyball, as well as baseball. Football is just not something that has been accessible to me in my life. I didn't know about the Premier League, the Bundesliga, La Liga, or anything like that. It's just kind of something that has been in the back burner of my life throughout the years. Like, there are people who have been into it or people who have played it, and it just never really caught me. What really caught me was during the last World Cup. I just happened to catch a few of the games, and somehow I just ended up falling in love with the sport. I didn't know any of the rules. I didn't know anything about the sport, and I just started learning and devouring everything that I could. And the hobby has actually consumed a lot of my time recently, and it's brought me a lot closer with friends who I didn't know were interested in the sport and actually watched it, but it's actually brought me a lot closer to people that live abroad or live in the UK or live in Europe. Like, they are very welcoming and have really kind of brought me in and taught me a lot. Just complete strangers that I met on the internet, just saying like, "Hey, like I'm an American that just recently got into the sport. What can you teach me? What can I learn? What can I read?" And they've really kind of like brought me in, and I really appreciate that. And I know that the ex-president of FIFA has fallen out of favor a lot because of the corruption and a lot of the documentaries that have come out about him. But the one thing that he would always say that was kind of beautiful and true is that the idea was that football actually could bring about like world peace, that it can actually unite people. And that is kind of like a very idealistic view of the sport. As we know, there is a lot of things that happen, especially with ultras, that you would think to yourself, oh, that's not really bringing peace to the world. But I understand that the sport is beautiful and it's played worldwide, and that a lot of people enjoy it, and that actually brings a lot of memory and a lot of emotion to a lot of different people. So that being said, we're going to jump into today's episode, where I'm going to talk about the Puerto Rican national team and their World Cup qualifying match of 1992. So the team was actually trying to qualify for the 1994 World Cup, and this was actually the first time in Puerto Rico's history of winning a qualifying match, which was against the Dominican Republic. They have had 6 previous attempts and had actually lost all those attempts. And again, there's a bit of a caveat here, which is to say that this was just one match out of a bunch of matches that they didn't get to play because they lost right after this. But what was beautiful was the way in which they won this game and the adversity that they faced um, on the way to play this World Cup qualifying match. So the team ultimately didn't end up qualifying for the World Cup in 1994. They were knocked out in the second round prem against Jamaica, and Mexico actually went on to win the World Cup qualifier for 1992 and eventually went on to play in the World Cup in 1994. Obviously, this was the first time the US hosted the World Cup, so they automatically qualified, so they didn't have to go through the qualifying process. So up until this point, the Puerto Rican Federation was actually pretty relatively new. It did not really go without any series of controversies, especially leading up to this match against the Dominican Republic. From a scoreboard that did not work and looked as if had caught on fire multiple times, to being stranded multiple times in different areas of Santo Domingo, having to train in basketball courts of New York City in the winter in order to prepare for this match, as well as practicing in manure fields of the Dominican Republic. This is the story of how a squad composed of mostly New York natives went on to win Puerto Rico's first ever World Cup qualifying match. So, before we get into the ridiculousness that the team faced back in 1992, as the Dominicans played a strong gamesmanship tactic against the team, I need to explain some of the context behind the 1994 World Cup. So this was the first time in the history of the World Cup that it was actually held in the United States. And this fact actually probably deserves its own deep dive episode sometime in the future. But the basic idea was that FIFA, as well as others, thought that hosting in the United States could actually help grow the sport because the sport was a very, it had a very untapped market in the United States. So at the time, the United States did not have its own professional soccer or football league. The North American Soccer League had collapsed in 1984 because attendance to matches actually dissipated quite a lot to the point where it was not even worth having the league anymore. So, a stipulation that FIFA put on the United States for hosting the World Cup was that they had to create a professional soccer league, which led to the creation of the MLS in 1993. But the MLS itself did not actively start running until 1996. So they kind of just created the league and a lot of the infrastructure behind it just so that they could host a World Cup. So there was a lot of hesitation to host the World Cup in the United States because of the fact that the sport is actually not popular, was not popular nationally in the 90s, but it's also not popular nationally currently. It's something that has kind of taken a lot of time to get people to really kind of not understand the sport, but to try and enjoy the sport. It's been a kind of a lot in terms of trying to get the broadcasting rights to the Premier League as well as other leagues over here. I would say that now is probably the best and easiest time to actually get into the sport and to really consume some of the foreign leagues and really see how football is played at a high level. But there's also a lot of stipulations to that in terms of playing the sport in the United States is actually really expensive. And it seems like a lot of people play the sports play football at a young age just to kind of get like a college scholarship and then drop it. So it's not really like kind of, it seems like a lot of people who actually end up playing the sport, they play it for some time because they think it's a fun after school activity and then just drop it and never really pick it up again and don't actually watch the sport. So it's kind of interesting because obviously in other countries, like the sport is kind of, like people really bleed football. Like they love football. Like if they could have gone pro, they would have. And it's something that people are very passionate across the world. But in the US, we obviously have other sports that kind of reign dominant. And that was the case in the 90s. Obviously, basketball, American football, baseball, these are sports that people really, really prioritize and choose over soccer or football. So there was a lot of hesitation for the US to host a World Cup in the 90s, but there was also very strong competition for Morocco and Brazil to host the games. The US actually ended up winning the bid and only spent around $500 million organizing and preparing for the tournament. Now, this leads me into how the qualifiers in North America, as well as Central America, as well as the Caribbean work, and how Puerto Rico ultimately got involved. So, CONCACAF, which is still around today, and it's an organization slash governing body, which is associated slash owned by FIFA. It kind of runs the North and Central America and Caribbean teams. And a little bit of a caveat here, I'm actually not even sure if they're owned by FIFA. They say that they're like part of FIFA. I couldn't really find a definite answer as to whether FIFA owns CONCACAF, but just know that CONCACAF is affiliated with FIFA, and it's just the organization or governing body that runs a lot of our games and schedules a lot of our games in an international level out here in the United States. So for the 1994 World Cup qualifiers, they were held in 1992. There were 20 teams competing. 14 were in the Caribbean branch and had to play off against one another, while 6 were in the Central America branch and had to play off against one another. And then the top teams of both went on to one final round where the winner was ultimately decided, which was Mexico. Now, we're up to speed with some of the context behind CONCACAF, behind the qualifier matches, and we can dive into the Puerto Rico national team and the crazy situation that they found themselves in 1992, which left them without their former manager, the Brazilian Victor Hugo Barros. Victor actually went on to coach the Puerto Rican national team in 2004 and again in 2014. But during the 1990 and 1991 appointment, it doesn't seem like Victor actually participated in any of the matches with the national team. I'm not even sure if they actually played any matches in during the 1990 to 1991 appointment. And the reason for his firing has actually been lost to the passage of time. I couldn't find anything about it. There doesn't seem to be any information at all about Victor Hugo Barros in terms of that 1990-1991 appointment. But I did find a photo of the squad that he managed during that year that he was in charge. So I'll put that in the show notes and you can see it on the screen. It's a very old photo. There's actually a really good website called Football Boricua, which has a lot of historical photos and a lot of historical context of the sport on the island. So Victor gets fired, and in protest of his firing, a lot of the Puerto Rican Federation players decide to boycott all the training leading up to their first qualifying match. And this causes a bit of a headache, and the president of the Puerto Rican Soccer Federation, Dr. Roberto Moroig, decides to reach out to Arnie Ramirez for help. I couldn't find how Roberto and Arnie were actually friends or how they knew each other. Arnie, I believe, is actually of Argentinian descent, so he's not even has any Puerto Rican heritage. But Arnie was actually the coach of the Long Island University soccer team in New York during these events. So Roberto decides to reach out to Arnie and says like, "Hey, can you help me out? Can you kind of step in as interim head coach?" So he actually doesn't even get the title, but he decides to step in and be the coach for the Puerto Rican national team for unofficially for some time. That doesn't solve the biggest problem, which is that a lot of the players from Puerto Rico who represent Puerto Rico are boycotting the team and boycotting the practices. So Arnie decides he wants to use mostly United States based players for the team, and this seems to be a decision that he makes even without even I feel like even without the boycott he would have chosen to play mostly US based players. It seems like this kind of solves like the issue of the boycott, but I believe that his decision to use US players kind of makes sense when you think about it. He's from New York. He lives in the New York area. There are a lot of Puerto Ricans in New York at this time. Obviously, the Bronx, Spanish Harlem, which is an area of Manhattan, as well as Brooklyn. There's a lot of deep Puerto Rican culture there. And when you think about it, he's also in New York. He has local players that he can play, that he can train and coach without having to go to Puerto Rico where everyone's boycotting the training. So he can stay in his local area and he can use some of the equipment that he already has by from coaching the university soccer team with these new players. So it kind of makes sense for Arnie to kind of recruit some of the players, but he does lose the plot a little bit, and we'll get to that here in a second. Being in the New York area means that Arnie can hold a lot of the trainings conveniently without having to fly to Puerto Rico and back and having to fly players from New York to Puerto Rico, etc. Obviously, the players in Puerto Rico are boycotting the team, so he has to make do with what he has. So he creates this ragtag group of players and he decides that he's going to call FIFA executive to see if he can actually play these players because some of them, despite having Puerto Rican descent, haven't actually lived on the island. So he calls a FIFA executive called Guigno Tononi to check to see if he can actually use these players from the United States as part of his squad. Tononi says, and this is a quote, he said, "Arnold, anybody who has a United States passport can play for Puerto Rico as long as they have never played for the United States." So this is a quote from Arnie for an article he did on The Guardian, on the website The Guardian, which is kind of looking back on this event 25 years. I think it was the 25-year anniversary, which was 8 years ago from when the article was posted. So, for those unfamiliar with Puerto Rico, it is actually a United States held territory. It's a lot like Guam, which means that citizens that are born in America are eligible to get a United States passport. You are considered an American citizen, despite being born on a Caribbean island that's pretty far from the United States. So, this is where the controversy actually starts to escalate. So, Arnie decides to go forward with his plan. He recruits players from the local amateur league and the semi-pro league. So out of the 23 players, which is, I believe, the maximum that you were allowed to have in a squad at the time, I'm unsure how big the squad actually was. Out of the 23 players, 14 of them were mainland Americans. So people who had never lived in Puerto Rico or maybe lived in Puerto Rico when they were really young. But out of the 14, 9 of them had no connection to Puerto Rico whatsoever. They had no heritage connection, and they also had no residential connection. So they were literally just Americans or of American descent that had a U.S. passport, never played for the United States, probably couldn't even speak Spanish, but saw the opportunity to play for a national team and play in a World Cup qualifier match and decided to jump at it. So this caused a lot of backlash from Puerto Ricans, and it also caused backlash from some of the Dominican Republic Federation, mostly the head coach for them at the time. And again, they were our first opponents, and I believe this was also the first qualifying match that was going to be played. So there was a lot of big hype. It's the first match ever to be played for a World Cup that's happening for the first time ever in the United States. So there's a lot of hype going on behind this match. There's a lot of press, and there's also a lot of negative press when it comes to the players because of the fact that quite a few of them have no Puerto Rican heritage. So the media and a lot of media papers decided to dub the team the not so Puerto Rican national team. And there was actually backlash from the Puerto Rican Olympic Committee behind this, but because they had no authority or say in the matter, since FIFA is the governing body, Arnie and the team just kind of decided to brush it off. They thought it was kind of weird that the Olympic Committee was trying to kind of stir the pot a little, but they just essentially brushed it off and kept going forward. Now, the coach of the Dominican Republic national team protested, alleging that the United States already had a team playing and that they shouldn't be allowed to have two teams competing. And this is a criticism and kind of like a rant that the coach for the Dominican Republic will bring up again after they lose to Puerto Rico 2-1. So this didn't stop Arnie, and it didn't stop the players from taking the training and the games seriously. They actually trained in the middle of winter in New York. They used the Long Island University gym, which was actually a basketball gym. So they were playing on wooden floors at very late hours of the night. Most of the team members actually had a day job, so they would work 10 to 12-hour shifts, and then they would come straight to training in a basketball court where they would play from 10 p.m. to midnight. So they were really grinding and getting everything together. And, this is probably for a lot of them the first time playing with one another. So they were running through tactics and they were playing football inside of a basketball court. So at this point, it's probably more akin to futsal than anything. So this was just the start of their troubles for the World Cup qualifier. They went from the freezing cold in New York straight to the Dominican Republic, where it's super hot and muggy year round. And when they landed in the Dominican Republic, they find that the hotel they booked has conveniently forgotten about their reservation and has not sent transport to them at the airport. So they're at the airport and they have no transportation from the airport to get to the hotel. So a quote from Arnie, a quote that Arnie gave The Guardian actually says, "I called up the hotel and I told them we needed transportation, needed a bus at a certain time," Arnie said. "When we got to the Dominican Republic, there was no bus. We waited for 3 hours. The people from the Dominican Federation said you were supposed to come tomorrow and not today, but we had already told them we were coming today." So once they get their bus, obviously they wait for 3 hours. And what's really interesting about this is that you actually see a lot of countries still pull stunts like this. And I believe this actually happened very recently to the Nigerian national team, where they were stuck at an airport for 8 hours. And it wasn't until a lot of the players started posting on Instagram that they were allowed to leave. So it very, very interesting, like how certain situations haven't changed from the 90s till now. But once the Puerto Rican national team and Arnie got to the hotel was called Comodoro. I believe it was actually in Santo Domingo. They were told that the reservation was until the next day, so they had to actually book rooms on the spot. And I'm pretty sure they actually had to pay a premium for that. So they settled. They got their rooms. They're relaxing, and Arnie decides to go speak to the head chef because he has this whole schedule that is like breakfast, lunch. This is when we're going to go practice. This is when we're going to have dinner, etc. And so he goes and he speaks to the head chef, explains the team's schedule, lets them know, hey, breakfast is at 8, lunch is at 2, dinner at 7. And then Arnie says, the next morning we go to breakfast at 8. Nobody's around. He says, what's going on? We forgot about it. I'm sorry, says the head chef. We'll have it in about half an hour. Finally, they show up at 9 o'clock. They screwed up my whole practice. So what Arnie starts to kind of piece together is that Dominicans are already playing a game of gamesmanship, which is when you kind of start to drop the ball in certain areas and act very lackluster and kind of start to impede your opposing team. So they kind of casually start doing things to screw over their practice and screw over their chances of actually competing well in the match. So Arnie says, he goes on to say with The Guardian, when you play away, these things happen. Arnie says, it happened to us when we played in the Caribbean Cup. We went to Guyana and we waited for 3 hours for a bus. They took us to a hotel, and it was a hotel for prostitutes. And I said, we can't stay here. When you play away against these teams, they try everything to mess you up, and they do it on purpose. You hear sometimes when the Americans go to Central America, and in the old days, you had bands making loud noises so they couldn't get any sleep. So the team is in Santo Domingo, in the Dominican Republic, a few days ahead of their match. They're already experiencing these issues. They experience issues as soon as they land. And, on top of the fact that they have like the entire nation of Puerto Rico pretty much mad at them for being the not so Puerto Rican national team, it's a lot that they're going through during these first few days, and it actually kind of gets worse as it goes on. So they decide to have their first practice after they land the next day, and one of the practice fields that is put out for them is actually a cow pasture that's full of manure. So they have to play on pretty much a field that doesn't have a lot of grass and that it's covered in manure. So you can imagine the smell. So the following day after that practice, they decide to have a practice on a field that's about a half hour away, which is in slightly better condition, but it's also used to house horses. So they have the practice. I believe they're out there for a few hours into the evening when a rolling blackout happens in the Dominican Republic, and it cuts all the lights around them. So they're out there in the middle of this field that houses horses in the complete dark. And one of the players actually kind of recounts this event. His name is Lugres, who is going to be an important figure later on. But Lugres is actually a Bronx native who actually had Puerto Rican heritage. And in the same Guardian article, he talks about Arnie, and he talks about this night where they were out there training and there's a rolling blackout. And he says Arnie had them jog back to the hotel while carrying their gear. They had been completely stranded, and the fact that they had to actually pay a taxi cab driver to drive in front of them with his headlights on so that they could see the way and so that other incoming cars could see them. So this is already a brutal second day of training, and they get back to the hotel. They relax. Obviously, it's been brutal, and the next day they're actually going to go and play the match. So it's game day. And as you can imagine, their troubles get a lot worse. The bus that's supposed to pick them up and take them to the stadium never shows up. So they have to go out of their way to hire a van, and the van is too small to carry all of them. So they have to make two trips. So Arnie decides, hey, this first van is going to take myself and the starting 11, and the van is going to come back and pick up the reserves. So this happens. They get to the stadium, they get a locker room, and when they go into the locker room, it's in awful conditions. The entire room smelled terrible because the toilets have been backed up and never fixed. It's just an awful stench. They can't focus. They can't actually change in there because it's so awful. So Arnie and the team managed to negotiate with the stadium employees, and they actually get moved from their locker room to a makeshift locker room that they actually make out of a delivery area, because the delivery area has benches and other things. So they get moved to this delivery area where bananas are constantly being delivered and where there's workers actually working. So they're in this delivery room with workers changing into their gear and also about to have a tactical meeting where they have to discuss tactics, but they find that they have no blackboard. So what does Arnie do? Arnie and the technical advisor decides to improvise. And because they have no blackboard, they find cups, they find water bottles, and they find oranges that were in the delivery room, and they sort them out and actually use that to run through their tactics and their strategy before their game. So it's really interesting how Arnie kind of, and the technical advisor for Puerto Rico, kind of use like these makeshift items to really try and get the team structured and to really try and get their head in the game, despite the fact that they've been facing all of these setbacks. It really kind of goes to show how great of a coach Arnie was and how a bit of a MacGyver he was, and that he could use anything and he could really get the team motivated, even if they were changing in like a stairwell or a delivery room. So the team actually went on to dominate the game against the Dominican Republic. There was an estimate of 5,000 spectators actually at the stadium, even though the stadium was in complete disarray. From what we know of the locker room, you can imagine how the pitch was and how the actual stands were. But Puerto Rico actually goes on to beat the Dominican Republic 2-1. They played an ultra conservative formation. And towards the later half of the game, they actually started to get sloppy, which is when they conceded that first goal. They ran out of steam. But leading up to this, Lugres is actually the player who scores the opening goal, and he actually uses the roughness and unbalance of the pitch to his advantage. He's quoted as saying, "It was a very bubbly field. It was dry and bumpy. The ball was played through and it kind of hopped a little bit, and I just hit it wide of the post. And I thought to myself, man, if I can get that again, I'll score." So 8 minutes later, Lugers got his chance. The ball bounced up just like before, but this time he was ready. He struck it perfectly off the left post and straight into the net, scoring Puerto Rico's first goal in the 1994 World Cup qualifying run. Lucas is quoted as saying, "I just started to run towards the bench," he recalls. "I did one of those knee slides you see today, only it felt like I was sliding on barbed wire. My knees were bleeding the rest of the game." But it didn't matter. The sheer joy of it, the relief from all the stress we'd gone through, it was magic, he says. It wasn't just about scoring the goal, and it wasn't about me. It was about everything we'd gone through together as a group, the camaraderie. We'd been beaten down in so many ways, but at that moment we knew we could win. We held on and got our dream. So Puerto Rico celebrated. They ended up winning when the ref blew the final whistle. A lot of the spectators from the stands actually rushed the pitch, and it was actually a pretty peaceful time. It didn't seem like there was any animosity. There was no incidents of violence that happened, but a lot of the spectators actually came onto the pitch. I couldn't find anything else, but I know that this is quoted as actually happening. And there's a little bit more to the story as we're reaching the end. So while Puerto Rico celebrated, the Dominican Republic's coach, Bernhard Stahl, I believe he's actually from Germany, he wasn't ready to accept the defeat quietly. He clashed with Arnie, taking his grievances to the FIFA officials that were actually at the match. He told them the U.S. can't have two teams. Arnie recalls, amused. The FIFA inspectors told him, no, Puerto Rico is not the United States. Arnie says, I guess he wasn't too familiar with geography. Zoll was relentless. He said he was going to play the game under protest, that he could lose his job if they didn't win. At one point, he even threatened to sue Arnie for $1 million. But Arnie told him, you can't do that. We followed every rule. I called FIFA, and they said these players were eligible. So again, it seemed like Zoll was kind of throwing everything that he could to try and get this match to go his way, but it didn't go his way. So after the final whistle, during the post-match interviews, Lucas actually went and grabbed a Puerto Rican flag and draped it around his shoulders, and was celebrating with a lot of the team members when kind of reporters came up to him and gave an interview. And I believe some of the reporters were actually from the BBC. So when a reporter asked him, hey, like, can someone have two homes? Lucas replied, you can have one in your heart and you can have one where you live, which is a beautiful reply, again, coming from a Puerto Rican descendant who, I don't know if he had actually visited the island or not, but he was from the Bronx. He was a Bronx native and he had Puerto Rican heritage. And back when I was growing up on the island, you always had this kind of, I don't want to say conflict, but it is a conflict where you had the Puerto Ricans who were born on the island, lived on the island, and then you had the New Yorkers, the Puerto Ricans who were born in New York and the surrounding areas of New York, and would come to the island because like they wanted to see their heritage. And there was a bit of a conflict there. It was almost as if sometimes the Puerto Ricans looked down on the New Yorkers because a lot of them weren't taught Spanish. They didn't really know the language, but they were very proud of where they were from, despite the fact that they suffered different struggles from us who were born there and lived there. And so I think that is a beautiful reply, which kind of goes to show you again the beauty of the sport and the beauty of the people that play the sport, which is like, hey, like, like his heart was in his heritage. Like he was from the Bronx, but his whole heart was in the fact that he could represent the Puerto Rican national team, and he played with all of his art and all of his determination. But the wild ride wasn't over, especially for Lugris. So after finishing up with the BBC crew, he realized that the team had actually left him stranded and had gone to the hotel without him and two of his teammates, Cosiel and Nazario. So stranded, they actually asked one of the stadium workers for a ride, and Lugris, not wanting to stir up any of the disappointed Dominican fans, actually tucked the Puerto Rican flag under his shirt, and they hopped in the back of a pickup truck stuffed with plantains and headed off towards the hotel. And Lugris finishes the story by saying, there we were, three guys in full soccer uniforms crammed into the back of this truck, Lugris says with a laugh. Stas told me, take the flag out. So we did. We held it high, letting it flap in the wind as we rode through the streets. People just stared at us like we were nuts. Three guys in a truck full of plantains, proudly holding the Puerto Rican flag on our way back to the hotel. It was surreal, but it was a moment I'll never forget. And that is the story of how a makeshift ragtag team of not so Puerto Ricans won Puerto Rico's first ever World Cup qualifying match. And that is it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I hope that you guys enjoyed it. And I hope that if you enjoy it, you leave a comment, you subscribe, and you share it with your friends. I will be back with another episode doing a roundup of funny news stories that have happened in the different leagues. And I'll be back again with a deeper dive sometime in the future. Thank you so much. Have a good one. Bye.